For 300 years, Earth had kept to itself, while the rest of the galaxy moved forward without them. And the Galactic Council that ruled over thousands of star systems barely gave humanity a second thought because they believed Earth was just another primitive world that knew its place in the grand scheme of things, and humanity seemed content to stay behind their own borders, watching silently as the great powers of the galaxy expanded and conquered and traded among themselves. Commander Jack Harper stood on the bridge of Outpost Omega, which floated at the very edge of human-controlled space, and his eyes tracked another Council merchant ship as it passed by just outside the boundary, and he had been doing this job for 20 years now, watching and recording every single vessel that came anywhere near Earth's territory, and every bit of data was sent back home to be studied and analyzed and filed away in the vast archives that humanity had been building since the day they decided to stay silent. Lieutenant Amy Brooks sat at her station running scans on the passing ship, and her fingers moved across the holographic controls with practiced ease, and she called out the details without looking up from her screen, because after 10 years of doing this, she could identify most Council ship types just from their energy signatures alone. And this one was a Viridian trade vessel heading toward the outer colonies with a cargo hold full of processed metals and synthetic materials. Jack nodded and made a note in the daily log because every detail mattered, and every piece of information added to the growing understanding of how the Council operated and what their strengths were, and more importantly, what their weaknesses might be if the day ever came when Earth needed to know such things, and he hoped that day would never come. But hope was not a strategy, and humanity had learned long ago that preparation was the only real defense against an uncertain universe. Down on Earth in a facility buried deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, Director Lisa Campbell reviewed the latest intelligence reports, and the underground complex known simply as the Vault stretched for miles in every direction, filled with 3 centuries worth of accumulated knowledge about every species in the Council, and their technologies and their military capabilities and their political structures and their cultural weaknesses, and humanity had been very busy during their long silence. Her chief analyst, Kevin Marsh, brought up a holographic display showing the latest Zelthari mining operations in the Outer Rim territories, and the reptilian species had been expanding aggressively for the past decade, strip mining entire worlds for their resources and leaving nothing but dead rocks behind, and they did not care much about the indigenous populations that sometimes got in their way. Lisa felt her jaw tighten as she watched footage of a Zelthari mining fleet descending on a pre-industrial world, and the native population had no defense against the orbital bombardment that cleared the surface before the mining equipment landed. And within weeks the planet would be stripped of everything valuable, and the Zelthari would move on to the next target, and the Council did nothing to stop them, because the Zelthari were powerful and influential, and the Council needed their support. Kevin pulled up another report showing similar operations by other Council species, and the pattern was clear to anyone who bothered to look. And the Galactic Council that claimed to stand for peace and cooperation and mutual prosperity was really just a protection racket for the strong and the advanced, while the weak were exploited or ignored or sometimes simply erased when they became inconvenient. This was why Earth had chosen silence all those years ago, and humanity had emerged into a galaxy that seemed promising at first with its grand speeches about unity and progress. But it had not taken long for the cracks to show and the corruption to become visible, and Earth's early ambassadors had returned home with troubling reports about what they had seen, and the decision had been made at the highest levels to withdraw and watch and wait. The policy of non-interference had not been easy, and there had been many debates over the years about whether humanity should speak up or take action when they witnessed injustices, but cooler heads had prevailed because Earth was not ready to challenge the Council, and revealing their concerns would only paint a target on humanity's back, and so they watched and they recorded and they built their strength in secret. While the Council believed Earth was a backwater world with limited technology and no real military capability, the truth was very different. And hidden shipyards on the dark side of the moon and in the asteroid belt and on Mars had been producing warships for 200 years, and each one incorporated technology that the Council had never seen, because humanity had taken a different approach to science and engineering. The Council species had all developed along similar technological paths, sharing knowledge and building on each other's discoveries, and this had led to rapid advancement, but also to a certain uniformity in their capabilities. But Earth had been isolated and forced to innovate independently, and the results were weapons and defenses and propulsion systems that worked on principles the Council did not understand. Jack Harper knew about the hidden fleet because every officer above a certain rank was briefed on Earth's true capabilities, and he had even served aboard one of the stealth frigates during a training exercise, and the experience had been humbling because the ship could do things that should have been impossible, and its weapons could tear through Council shields like they were not even there. But the fleet was a secret that had to be kept, because the moment the Council learned about it, they would respond with overwhelming force, and 3,000 Council warships could not be stopped by 200 human vessels, no matter how advanced they were. And so the waiting continued and the silence held. On the Council's capital world of Concordia, Ambassador Velcrin of the Zelthari species addressed the assembled delegates in the Great Crystal Chamber, and his reptilian features twisted with contempt as he spoke about Earth's latest refusal to open their borders to Council trade inspectors, and he suggested that perhaps it was time to remind the humans that independence had limits. The Archon Prime who led the Council raised one clawed hand for silence, and his ancient voice carried across the chamber, and he reminded Velcrin that Earth had broken no laws, and their territory was their own to govern as they saw fit, and the Council had no authority to force them into compliance as long as they remained within their own borders. Velcrin settled back into his seat, but his eyes burned with frustration, because the Zelthari had been trying to gain access to Earth's solar system for decades, and they suspected that valuable resources existed in the asteroid belt and the outer planets, but humanity refused all requests for joint mining operations, and there was nothing the Zelthari could do about it without violating Council law. What Velcrin did not know was that Earth's refusal had nothing to do with resources and everything to do with security, because allowing Council ships into the solar system would reveal the hidden bases and shipyards and defense platforms that humanity had spent centuries building, and the secret would be exposed, and the careful balance that Earth had maintained would collapse. Lisa Campbell closed the latest reports and leaned back in her chair, and the weight of 300 years of policy pressed down on her shoulders, because she knew that the silence could not last forever, and eventually something would happen that would force Earth to reveal itself, and she hoped that when that day came, humanity would be ready for what followed, because once they stepped out of the shadows, there would be no going back. The incident that would change everything started without any warning on a day that seemed like any other, and a Council survey ship called the Dawn Trader crossed into the Kuiper Belt, which was well inside Earth's declared territorial space, and it was not the first time Council vessels had tested the boundaries, but it was the first time one had come this far into the solar system. Captain Ryan Mitchell commanded a stealth frigate called Shadowwing, and his ship was one of 50 such vessels that patrolled the outer reaches watching for exactly this kind of intrusion, and his sensors picked up the Council ship immediately, and the computer identified it as a Zelthari mineral survey vessel with light defensive armaments and a crew of about 30. Ensign Sophie Turner called out the contact from her station, and her voice was steady despite the tension that suddenly filled the bridge, because everyone knew that this was different from the usual border violations, and the Zelthari ship was not just close to the boundary, but had crossed it by a significant margin and was actively scanning the asteroid belt for resources. Ryan opened a communication channel, and his message was short and clear, because there was no point in being diplomatic when someone was trespassing in your home, and he identified his ship and ordered the Zelthari vessel to withdraw immediately. But the response he got was not what he expected. The Zelthari captain, whose name was Kreth, appeared on the screen with an expression that could only be described as amused, and his reptilian features twisted into what passed for a smile among his species, and he stated that the region was unclaimed under Council charter because Earth lacked the presence to enforce territorial claims beyond their immediate planetary orbits. Ryan felt his jaw tighten, and he delivered one more warning and made it clear that this was not a negotiation, but Kreth just laughed, and the sound was harsh and grating, and then he cut the communication, and his ship continued its scans as if the human vessel was not even there. The Shadowwing had been built for exactly this kind of situation, and Ryan contacted Earth Command using the quantum communication system that could not be intercepted or jammed, and within 3 minutes, he had Director Campbell herself on the line, and her orders were clear and precise, and they gave him full authorization to use whatever force was necessary to defend territorial integrity. What happened next would become known throughout the galaxy as the Kuiper incident, and it lasted exactly 47 seconds from the moment Ryan gave the order to fire until the Dawn Trader went dead in space, and the human weapons were unlike anything the Council had ever encountered, because they used principles that should not have worked according to conventional physics. Precision beam weapons carved through the Zelthari ship's engines like they were made of paper, and the communications array was destroyed in the same instant, cutting off any chance for the crew to call for help. And the power systems failed one by one as targeted strikes took out every critical system while leaving the hull intact and the crew alive. Sophie monitored the Zelthari life signs and reported that all crew members were alive and uninjured, but confused and probably terrified. And Ryan opened a channel again, and his voice was cold as ice as he gave them 30 minutes to evacuate into their emergency pods and informed them that a retrieval drone would return them to Council space, but their ship would be confiscated. The Zelthari crew did not argue, and the emergency pods launched within 15 minutes, and a human recovery drone collected them and began the long journey back to the nearest Council outpost, and the pods had enough life support for the trip, but no communications equipment and no way to tell anyone what had happened until they arrived. The Dawn Trader itself was quickly surrounded by human salvage vessels that had been waiting nearby, and within 6 hours the ship had been completely disassembled, and every component was on its way to research facilities where teams of scientists would study Zelthari technology in detail, and nothing would be wasted because knowledge was the most valuable resource in the universe. When the Zelthari crew finally reached a Council outpost 2 days later, they were traumatized and confused, and their story seemed impossible because they insisted that a single human ship had disabled their vessel in less than a minute using weapons that ignored their shields and cut through their armor without leaving any heat signatures or radiation traces. The Council's initial reaction was disbelief, because everyone knew that Earth was technologically backward, and their military capabilities were assumed to be minimal at best. But then the data from the escape pods was analyzed, and the recordings showed exactly what the crew had described, and suddenly the impossible became terrifyingly real. Ambassador Velkrin convened an emergency session of the Council, and the crystal chamber was filled with angry voices as delegates argued about what to do, and Velkrin himself was practically screaming about acts of war and the need for immediate retaliation, and he demanded that the Council send a fleet to Earth and force them to return the stolen vessel and surrender those responsible. The Archon Prime listened to all the arguments and then raised his hand for silence, and his old eyes were troubled as he pointed out that the Dawn Trader had been inside Earth's territory, and the crew had been returned unharmed and under counsel. Humanity had every right to defend their borders, and the loss of the ship was unfortunate, but not illegal. Velkrin was not satisfied with this answer, and he argued that Earth's territorial claims were excessive and unreasonable, and no species had the right to claim an entire star system when they only inhabited one planet. But other delegates pointed out that many Council species had made similar claims, and they had been accepted without question. The debate raged for hours, and in the end the Council decided to send a diplomatic message demanding the return of the Dawn Trader and an apology for the incident. But there was no mention of military action because too many delegates were now uncertain about Earth's true capabilities. On Earth, the mood in the vault was tense but controlled, and Lisa Campbell stood before the assembled military leadership, and civilian government representatives, and holographic displays showed the Council's response and the diplomatic message that demanded things humanity had no intention of providing. Admiral Greg Foster, who commanded Earth's hidden fleet, pulled up tactical projections showing various scenarios for how the Council might escalate, and his analysis was thorough and detailed, and he concluded that Earth could defend the solar system against any reasonable attack, but a sustained siege would be problematic. Senator Claire Matthews, who represented the civilian government, was worried about the long-term implications because once Earth revealed its military strength, there would be no going back to the comfortable anonymity of the past 3 centuries, and the galaxy would see humanity as either a threat or a potential ally, and either option came with complications. Lisa agreed that the situation was delicate, but she also pointed out that the Dawn Trader incident had been inevitable, and sooner or later the Council was going to test Earth's boundaries, and now they had their answer, and the question was whether they would accept it or push for more. Jack Harper was recalled from Outpost Omega to take command of one of the battle groups that was being prepared for potential combat, and he met with Admiral Foster to review the tactical situation, and both men knew that the next few weeks would determine whether Earth's long silence had been wisdom or merely delay. The Council's diplomatic message arrived, and it was full of formal language and veiled threats, and Earth's response was equally formal but absolutely firm, and Director Campbell herself delivered it in a recorded message that would be seen by every Council delegate. She stated clearly that the Dawn Trader had violated Earth's territory and had ignored warnings to withdraw, and the vessel had been seized in accordance with humanity's right to defend their borders, and the crew had been returned unharmed as a gesture of goodwill, but the ship itself would not be returned, and Earth would not apologize for defending what was theirs. The message was calculated to be respectful but unyielding, and it made clear that Earth was not afraid of the Council and would not be intimidated into backing down, and the subtext was obvious to anyone who understood politics because humanity was drawing a line and daring the Council to cross it. Velcrin watched the message 3 times, and each viewing made him angrier because he heard the challenge in Campbell's words, and he knew that his own credibility within the Council depended on how he responded, and doing nothing was not an option because the other species would see it as weakness. He began making calls to other delegates and building support for military action, and he argued that Earth's defiance could not be tolerated because it would encourage other species to challenge Council authority, and the alliance that had held the galaxy together for 1,000 years would fracture. The Galactic Council's response came 2 weeks after the Kuiper incident, and it arrived in the form of 60 warships led by Fleet Commander Athrix of the Viridian Imperium, who was known throughout Council space as a veteran of countless campaigns, and he brought his fleet to the edge of the solar system in a formation designed to demonstrate overwhelming force. Commander Athrix broadcast his message on all frequencies, and his voice carried the weight of absolute authority as he announced that Earth had violated Council protocols and destroyed a peaceful survey vessel, and he demanded that humanity surrender. Those responsible for the attack and open their territory to Council oversight, or face severe consequences. On Outpost Omega, Jack Harper watched the Council fleet appear on his sensors, and he counted the ships one by one and noted their types and positions, and he allowed himself a thin smile, because the Council had no idea what they had just walked into, and their careful formation and impressive numbers meant nothing against what Earth had prepared. The response from Earth came not with words but with action, and all across the solar system hidden bases suddenly became visible as their stealth fields dropped, and the Moon and Mars and dozens of asteroids revealed military installations that had been built over centuries and orbital fortresses that had been disguised as space debris powered up their weapons systems. From these hidden positions, Earth's fleet emerged like ghosts materializing out of empty space, and over 100 warships appeared where moments before there had been nothing, and each vessel incorporated technology that made Council ships look like relics from a forgotten age. The human ships used stealth systems that bent light around their hulls, making them nearly impossible to target, and their communications ran on quantum-linked channels that could not be jammed or intercepted, and their weapons operated on principles that the Council's best scientists would need decades to understand. But the ships were only part of what Earth revealed that day, and the orbital fortresses and planetary shields and automated defense networks filled near-Earth space with overlapping fields of fire, and every weapon system was linked through artificial intelligence networks that could coordinate attacks faster than any organic crew. Commander Athrix watched his tactical display fill with contacts, and his confidence evaporated as he realized that his fleet had been surrounded before they even knew the enemy was there, and the human vessels appeared at every angle, cutting off his retreat and boxing his ships into a killing zone. Admiral Foster's voice came through every Council ship's communication system, and it was calm and measured, and somehow that made it more terrifying than any amount of shouting would have been, and he identified himself as Commander of Earth Defense and gave Athrix 1 hour to withdraw beyond the heliopause. Athrix tried to project confidence as he responded, and he pointed out that the Council fleet outnumbered the human ships and implied that Earth would not dare to start a war against the combined might of the Galactic Council. But even as he spoke, the words, he knew they sounded hollow. Admiral Foster's reply was simple and devastating, and he suggested that Athrix check his sensors again and look very carefully at what his tactical computer was telling him about the human vessels and their capabilities. When Athrix did exactly that, his blood ran cold because the analysis was clear and brutal, and his computer estimated that in a direct engagement, his fleet would last less than 4 minutes before being completely destroyed, and the human ships had already achieved target, locks on every council vessel simultaneously. The Viridian commander was not a coward, and he had faced death many times in his long career. But he was also not a fool, and he could see that this battle was unwinnable, and sacrificing his entire fleet would accomplish nothing except proving Earth's superiority. He gave the order to withdraw, and his ships began turning away from Earth and preparing to jump back to council space. And it was a humiliating retreat, but it was better than the alternative, and at least he could report back on what they had discovered. But Ambassador Velkrin, who was observing from his command ship in the second wave of the fleet, refused to accept the retreat, and his voice cut across the command channel countermanding Athrix's orders, and he commanded all Zelthari vessels to continue the attack. 23 Zelthari warships broke formation and surged toward Earth, and their weapons charged and their crews prepared for combat, because they believed in their ambassador's certainty that the humans were bluffing and would not dare to fire on council ships. Captain Jack Harper commanded a battleship called Defiant, and he had been waiting for this moment ever since he learned about Earth's true capabilities years ago. And when Admiral Foster gave the order for weapons free, Jack felt something like relief, because the waiting was finally over. The Zelthari assault met a response that was precise and overwhelming and devastating, and the human weapons demonstrated capabilities that seemed to violate the known laws of physics, and gravity manipulation weapons crushed ships like empty cans, and their hulls imploded under forces that should not have been possible. Energy beams that operated outside normal space bypassed the Zelthari shields entirely and burned through their armor as if it did not exist, and kinetic projectiles accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed punched holes straight through multiple ships in a single shot. Sophie Turner called out targets as they were eliminated, and her voice was steady and professional, and she felt no satisfaction in the destruction, but she understood its necessity, because the Council needed to learn that Earth's warnings were not empty threats. The entire engagement lasted 90 seconds from the first shot to the last, and when it was over, 23 Zelthari warships were either destroyed or disabled and drifting dead in space, and not one human vessel had taken significant damage, because the battle had been so one-sided that the Zelthari had barely managed to fire their weapons. The rest of the Council fleet fled, and their jump to faster-than-light travel was hasty and uncoordinated, and several ships nearly collided in their panic to escape, and Commander Athrix watched his sensors as ship after ship disappeared, and he felt shame and relief in equal measure. Automated human recovery craft moved through the debris field immediately, and they began rescuing Council survivors from the wrecked ships and pulling them from escape pods and providing medical attention, because Earth had no desire to massacre helpless crews, and the goal had been to demonstrate capability, not to commit genocide. The galaxy watched the battle through leaked footage and intercepted transmissions, and every major civilization saw what happened when the Council's military might met Earth's prepared defenses, and the myth of Council superiority died that day among the wreckage floating in Earth's outer system. On Concordia, the Council chamber was in chaos as delegates screamed at each other and pointed fingers and tried to understand how everything had gone so wrong, and over half the species' representatives were already talking about withdrawing from the Council because an organization that could not protect its members was worthless. The Archon Prime sat in his seat and watched the collapse of everything he had worked to maintain, and his ancient face showed no emotion. But inside he felt the weight of failure, because he had known the Council was corrupt, and he had done nothing to stop it. And now the reckoning had arrived. Ambassador Velkrin was notably absent from the emergency session, because he had barricaded himself in his quarters after learning that every Zelthari ship in the assault had been destroyed, and his political career was over, and possibly his life, because the Zelthari government would need someone to blame for the disaster. Ambassador Kane of the Centauran Alliance stood and called for order, and her voice cut through the chaos, and she stated what everyone was thinking, but few wanted to admit, which was that the Council had lost not just militarily, but morally, because Earth had been right about their corruption. She proposed that instead of planning revenge or further military action, the Council should ask Earth for terms and try to understand what humanity wanted, because continuing this conflict would only lead to more losses and the complete dissolution of galactic civilization. Some delegates shouted her down and called her a coward and a traitor, but others listened because they could see the truth in her words. and they knew that pride would not rebuild destroyed ships or restore lost credibility. Lisa Campbell received reports of the Council's disarray with grim satisfaction, because the battle had gone exactly as planned, and Earth had demonstrated its power without committing atrocities, and the survivors would carry the message back to their governments that humanity was not to be trifled with. But she also knew that this was just the beginning, because the Council would not accept defeat easily, and there would be political maneuvering and attempts to build coalitions against Earth, and the real challenge would be maintaining the moral high ground while defending against whatever came next. Admiral Foster reviewed the battle recordings and compiled lessons learned, and he was satisfied with his fleet's performance, but also aware that they had faced a confused and demoralized enemy, and a more organized assault would be harder to stop even with Earth's technological advantages. Jack Harper stood on the bridge of Defiant as repair crews checked the ship's systems, and he thought about the Zelthari crews who had died. Earth's next move surprised the entire galaxy, because instead of preparing for the inevitable counterattack, humanity launched an information offensive that was more devastating than any weapon, and director Lisa Campbell stood before a broadcast, a ray that would transmit directly to every inhabited world in Council space, bypassing all official channels and government filters. Her message was simple and direct, and it began with a statement that would echo across 1,000 worlds. And she said that for 3 centuries Earth had remained silent and watched, and the Council had believed it was fear. But they had been wrong, because humanity's silence had been strategic and purposeful. What followed was the most comprehensive release of classified information in galactic history, and Earth transmitted 300 years of carefully documented evidence showing every atrocity and crime and act of corruption that the Council had committed or ignored or actively covered up. The files included detailed records of the genocide committed against the Deltari species, when their homeworld was found to contain rare minerals, and the Council had classified the planet as uninhabited, despite knowing that 15 million Deltari lived there, and Zelthari mining fleets had sterilized the surface from orbit. There were communications showing how Council officials had orchestrated the forced relocation of 17 different civilizations, moving them from resource-rich worlds to barren planets, where most of them eventually died, and the emptied worlds were then sold to mining corporations for massive profits that went into private accounts. Earth revealed evidence of systematic exploitation of pre-spaceflight species, and the files showed how Council survey teams would identify developing civilizations and then manipulate their progress to benefit Council interests, and sometimes they would provide technology that seemed helpful but was designed to create dependency, and sometimes they would instigate conflicts to keep populations divided and weak. Captain Ryan Mitchell provided detailed military analysis breaking down Council battle tactics and showing how Earth had spent centuries preparing countermeasures for every scenario, and he explained in clear terms how humanity's isolation had allowed them to develop along different technological paths, and the result was weapons and defenses that Council science could not match. But the most damaging revelations came from the financial records that Earth had somehow obtained through methods they did not explain. And these documents showed a web of corruption that touched almost every level of Council government and proved that the ideals of peace and cooperation were nothing but propaganda, hiding a system designed to enrich the powerful. On worlds throughout Council space, riots erupted as populations learned that their governments had been lying to them for centuries, and species that had trusted the Council's leadership discovered they had been systematically betrayed and used and discarded when they were no longer profitable. The Arxians, who had always been loyal Council members, found evidence that their own representatives had sold the rights to their colony worlds to Zelthari mining corporations, and entire planets full of Arxian settlers had been abandoned to make room for strip mining operations, and the profits had gone to a handful of corrupt officials. The Viridians discovered that their military had been deployed to suppress peaceful protests on dozens of worlds, and they had been told they were fighting terrorists and insurgents, but the files showed that most of the targets were just civilians asking for basic rights and fair treatment. Even species that had benefited from Council membership found evidence of crimes committed in their names, and many governments tried to suppress the information, but Earth had transmitted it directly to individual receivers and personal communication devices, and there was no way to stop billions of people from learning the truth. In the Council chamber on Concordia, The Archon Prime watched his authority crumble in real time as delegates abandoned their seats, and governments recalled their ambassadors, and the alliance that had held the galaxy together for 1,000 years fractured into 1,000 pieces. Ambassador Velkrin emerged from his quarters long enough to address the remaining delegates, and his voice was full of rage as he declared that Earth had committed an act of information warfare, and the only appropriate response was total war and the complete destruction of humanity before they could spread more poison. Ambassador Kane stood to oppose him, and her voice was steady and clear as she pointed out that Earth had simply told the truth, and if that truth was destroying the Council, then perhaps the Council deserved to be destroyed, and maybe something better could be built from the ruins. The vote was called to authorize military action against Earth, and 32 species supported immediate war, while 15 abstained or called for diplomatic solutions, and the motion passed by the narrowest margin possible, and the Council war fleet began to mobilize. Over 3,000 warships gathered from every corner of Council space, and it was the largest military force ever assembled in galactic history, and every species contributed vessels because even those who questioned the war understood that Earth represented a threat to the established order. On Earth, the intelligence reports confirmed what everyone expected, and Lisa Campbell stood before the assembled leadership and informed them that the Council had chosen war, and the fleet would arrive in approximately 3 weeks, and humanity needed to be ready for the largest battle in its history. Senator Matthews asked if there was any chance of avoiding the conflict, and her voice carried hope that seemed fragile and desperate, and Lisa shook her head because the Council could not back down now without losing all credibility, and Earth could not surrender without abandoning everything they had worked for. Admiral Foster displayed tactical projections showing the size of the approaching fleet, and the numbers were sobering because 3,000 ships was 10 times larger than anything Earth had prepared for, and even with technological superiority, the human fleet would be outnumbered 30-1. But Foster also showed the defensive preparations that had been ongoing for 3 centuries, and explained how the entire solar system had been turned into a fortress with overlapping fields of fire and automated defense networks and weapons platforms hidden throughout the asteroid belt and the outer planets. Jack Harper reviewed the battle plans and understood his role in the coming fight, and his battle group would be positioned near Jupiter, ready to strike at the Council fleet's flanks when they committed to their assault. And it would be dangerous work, but someone had to do it, and he was glad it would be him. The human population was informed of the approaching threat through carefully worded announcements that explained the situation without causing panic, and most people understood that this moment had been inevitable since the day Earth chose to remain silent and watch the Council's crimes. Preparations intensified across every human world and colony, and volunteers flooded recruitment centers wanting to help defend their home, and factories switched to war production, and scientists worked around the clock to improve weapon systems and find any advantage that might help in the coming battle. Meanwhile, the Council War fleet gathered at a staging point just outside the heliopause, and Fleet Marshal Korvax took command of the Armada and began organizing the massive force into battle formations, and he had fought in dozens of campaigns, but never had he commanded so many ships at once. Korvax studied what intelligence the Council had managed to gather about Earth's capabilities, and the reports were troubling because the human ships seemed to operate on principles that should not work, and their weapons had demonstrated impossible levels of precision and power. But he also knew that numbers mattered, and no amount of technology could overcome a 30-1 disadvantage, and even if the humans destroyed half his fleet before going down, the Council would still win, and Earth would be occupied, and humanity would learn the price of defiance. His staff prepared detailed attack plans that would send waves of ships at Earth from multiple directions, simultaneously overwhelming the defenders through sheer volume of fire, and some ships would be lost, but the rest would break through, and then it would be over. On Concordia, the remaining Council delegates watched preparations with mixed feelings, and some believed this was necessary to restore order, while others worried that they were making a terrible mistake, and a few quietly began making plans to withdraw from the Council regardless of the battle's outcome. The Archon Prime met privately with Ambassador Kane and admitted that he had failed in his duty to reform the Council from within, and she told him that perhaps some institutions were too corrupt to be saved and needed to be torn down, so something better could grow. Lisa Campbell spent the final days before the battle reviewing every detail of Earth's defense, and she knew that humanity would survive because the defensive preparations were too strong, but she also knew that the cost would be high, and many people would die before this was over. She recorded a message to be released after the battle regardless of the outcome, and in it she explained why Earth had remained silent for so long, and why they had finally chosen to speak, and she expressed hope that whatever came next would be better than what had come before because the galaxy deserved leaders who actually believed in the ideals they claimed to uphold. The Council War fleet arrived in Earth's solar system in a carefully coordinated jump that brought 3,000 warships into existence across the outer system simultaneously, and Fleet Marshal Korvax had positioned his forces in a pattern designed to attack from every direction at once, and he believed that even Earth's advanced technology could not defend against such overwhelming numbers. His flagship was a massive dreadnought called Inexorable Truth, and from its bridge he commanded the largest military force ever assembled, and he broadcast his final ultimatum on all frequencies, demanding Earth's immediate and unconditional surrender, with trials for those responsible for the Kuiper incident and the information warfare that had destabilized the Council. The response from Earth was silence, and Korvax took that as defiance, and he ordered his sensor operators to locate the human fleet and prepare to engage. But what his sensors found made no sense because instead of gathering for a defensive stand, Earth's warships were scattered throughout the system in small groups. His tactical officer reported contacts appearing on the displays, and at first there were dozens and then hundreds and then thousands, and the numbers kept climbing as more and more signatures appeared, and Korvax realized with growing horror that his fleet had not entered a battlefield but a trap that had been prepared for centuries. The first wave of Earth's defense came not from ships but from installations that humanity had built over decades and hidden throughout the solar system, and quantum-compressed missiles launched from asteroid bases that the Council had never detected, and directed energy weapons fired from satellites disguised as space debris. The Council's careful formation became a liability, as overlapping fields of fire tore into their ranks, and ships that had been positioned close together for mutual support found themselves unable to maneuver without colliding, and the automated targeting systems that Earth had deployed tracked multiple targets simultaneously with inhuman precision. 12 Council ships were destroyed in the opening salvo, and their shields collapsed under weapons fire that operated on frequencies they could not block, and 20 more were crippled as electronic warfare attacks overwhelmed their computer systems and left them drifting helpless. Korvax screamed orders to return fire, but his crews struggled to target the human weapons platforms because the stealth technology made them nearly invisible, and when his ships did manage to get target locks, the platforms were protected by defensive fields that absorbed or deflected incoming attacks. Then Earth's actual fleet arrived, and 147 human warships dropped their stealth fields simultaneously and appeared in perfect formation surrounding the Council fleet, and each vessel had already achieved weapons lock-on, multiple targets, and they were positioned at optimal firing angles. Admiral Foster's voice cut through every communication channel in the system, and he identified himself and gave the Council fleet one final opportunity to withdraw, and he explained calmly that continued aggression would result in their complete destruction, and he urged Korvax to consider the lives of his crews. Korvax looked at his tactical display, and his hands shook as he realized the true extent of his mistake, because the human ships were not just more advanced, but operated on principles that made traditional naval tactics obsolete, and his computer was estimating fleet survival time at less than 4 minutes in direct combat. He was a proud officer who had won many battles, and he did not want to believe that he could be so thoroughly outmatched. But the evidence was undeniable, and every instinct he had developed over decades of combat was screaming at him to withdraw before it was too late. His hand moved toward the communications panel to order a retreat, but before he could speak, Ambassador Velkrin's voice cut across the command channel, and the Zelthari representative was aboard one of the command ships in the second wave, and he countermanded Korvax's authority. Velkrin ordered all Zelthari vessels to continue the attack, and he declared that the humans were bluffing and would not dare to destroy the fleet because it would make them the aggressors and turn the entire galaxy against them. And 23 Zelthari warships broke formation and surged toward Earth. Captain Jack Harper had been waiting on the bridge of Defiant for this exact moment, and when Admiral Foster gave the order for weapons free, he felt a grim satisfaction because the Council had been given every chance to avoid this, and they had chosen violence. The engagement that followed was not a battle, but a demonstration of absolute technological superiority, and the human weapons operated with precision that seemed almost surgical as they targeted and eliminated each Zelthari ship in turn. Gravity. Manipulation weapons created localized fields that compressed the Zelthari vessels until their hulls imploded, and the ships crumpled like paper crushed in an invisible fist, and there was no defense against forces that operated outside normal space. Energy beams phased through shields as if they were not there, and burned through armor and into critical systems, and ships lost power and atmosphere and artificial gravity in seconds, and their crews had no time to reach escape pods before their vessels became coffins. Kinetic projectiles accelerated to relativistic speeds punched through multiple ships in single shots, and the impact energy was so great that it vaporized everything it touched and left nothing but expanding clouds of superheated plasma where warships had been moments before. Sophie Turner monitored the battle from her station and called out targets as they were neutralized, and her voice remained professional and steady because she had trained for years to maintain composure in combat. But inside, she felt sick at the scale of destruction, even though she knew it was necessary. The entire engagement lasted 90 seconds, and when it ended, 23 Zelthari warships had been reduced to debris fields and scattered wreckage, and not one had managed to inflict any damage on Earth's forces because the technological gap was simply too large to overcome. The rest of the Council fleet fled in complete disorder, and their jump to faster-than-light travel was panicked and uncoordinated, and several ships nearly collided as 3,000 vessels tried to escape simultaneously, and Korvax watched his command disintegrate around him. Human recovery craft moved through the debris immediately and began searching for survivors, and they pulled escape pods from the wreckage and provided medical attention to wounded Council personnel, because Earth's quarrel was with the Council's leadership, not with the ordinary crews who followed orders. The footage of the battle spread across the galaxy within hours because Earth made no attempt to suppress it, and every civilization saw what happened when the Council's military might faced humanity's prepared defenses, and the message was clear that the old order was finished. On Concordia, the Council chamber was nearly empty as delegates fled and governments recalled their representatives and declared independence from an organization that could no longer protect them or claim any moral authority, and the Archon Prime sat alone in his seat and watched the end of everything he had known. Ambassador Kane was one of the few who remained, and she stood before the Archon and suggested that instead of clinging to the past, they should work with Earth to build something new and better. And the old leader looked at her with tired eyes and nodded because there was no other choice. Lisa Campbell transmitted Earth's terms within an hour of the battle's end, and her message went to every world in Council space, and she explained that humanity had not sought this conflict, but would not allow the Council's corruption to continue. She demanded the dissolution of the current Council power structure and the formation of a new galactic assembly with equal representation for all species, including those the Council had oppressed, and she called for independent tribunals to investigate crimes committed under Council authority. In exchange, Earth would share its technological advances and help rebuild a galactic civilization based on actual cooperation instead of domination, and humanity would help the galaxy become what it had always claimed to be, but never was. But she also made clear that Earth would no longer remain silent, and humanity would watch and judge, and if the galaxy ever again descended into tyranny, there would be no 300-year wait before intervention. The response from across the galaxy was mixed but mostly positive, because populations that had suffered under Council rule saw hope for the first time in generations, and even some Council species welcomed the change because they recognized that the old system had been broken beyond repair. 5 years later, Jack Harper stood on an observation deck of the orbital station Unity 1 and watched delegates from 300 species arrive for the first session of the new Galactic Assembly, and the old Council was gone, and its corrupt structures dismantled, and something better was being built in its place. Lieutenant Amy Brooks, who now served as his executive officer, asked if he thought the new system would last, and Jack considered the question carefully before answering that it would depend on whether the species of the galaxy had learned anything from the Council's failure. She asked what would happen if they failed again, and Jack smiled and told her that Earth would be watching because humanity was very good at that, and 300 years of silence had taught them patience, but also the importance of knowing when silence itself became complicity. In the vault beneath the Rocky Mountains,